Our family always looked perfect. Not the glossy kind of perfection from advertisements, but the quiet, modest kind that neighbors, teachers, and distant relatives admire. The kind people describe with the words, "They're lucky." There were no loud arguments in our home. No doors slammed in anger. No tears spilling out onto the stairwell. We never aired our conflicts in public, never raised our voices, never allowed emotions to cross invisible boundaries. Our house was always clean, our children well-behaved, our conversations polite. And over time, that very perfection became our greatest problem. My name is Anna, and if someone had asked me a few years ago to describe my life in one word, I would have said settled. I didn't marry out of foolishness or sudden passion. I married consciously, almost rationally. My husband, Sergey, was reliable, stable, the kind of man who felt like solid ground beneath your feet rather than a storm in the air. He never promised the impossible, but he always came home on time, always paid the bills, always kept his word. After a chaotic childhood, I didn't dream of adventure. I dreamed of peace. Sergey had always been reserved. Even in moments of joy, he never raised his voice, never gestured wildly, never laughed too loudly. His emotions lived somewhere deep inside him, and he didn't believe they needed to be shown. I accepted this as a personality trait, something you simply learn to live with. I was more expressive at first, more emotional, but over the years, I grew quieter too. Not suddenly, not dramatically. I simply adapted to the rhythm of our home, where the most important rule was not to disturb the balance. Our children grew up in that silence. Lisa, our eldest, was observant from an early age. She rarely cried, rarely complained, rarely demanded attention. It was enough for her to be nearby, to listen, to remember. She learned early how to read faces, pauses, intonations. When she asked me whether I was happy, there was no childish curiosity in her eyes. There was caution, as if she were preparing herself for any possible answer. Now she is 16, and she hardly asks questions at all. She studies well, draws constantly, and spends hours in her room with headphones on, listening to music filled with more emotion than our family conversations ever held. Artem is different. He is younger, 10 years old, and he hasn't yet learned how to be convenient. He is loud, emotional, easily hurt. He laughs without restraint and cries sincerely. Sometimes Sergey tenses up around him, as if unsure where to place himself. He often says Artem will outgrow it. And every time, I think about how important it is that he doesn't outgrow it too soon, that he doesn't learn to dim himself the way we did. Our days followed a familiar pattern. Mornings looked the same, evenings ended the same. We had dinner together, discussed grades, work, plans for the weekend. Everything was correct. Everything was calm. And within that correctness, something essential slowly disappeared. The feeling that we were truly living, rather than simply fulfilling our roles, husband, wife, parents. I work at a library, and perhaps that's where I first realized that silence can be different. There, it was honest. No one pretended everything was fine. People came for books to escape themselves, or, on the contrary, to move closer to their own thoughts. Sometimes I felt I knew the visitors better than they knew me, because I saw what they chose to read, what they reached for. And the longer I worked there, the clearer it became. I was hiding too, not between pages, but between roles. The turning point was almost invisible. An ordinary evening, ordinary fatigue, ordinary news playing on the television. I was washing dishes when Sergey asked me to lower the water because the sound bothered him. He said it calmly, without irritation. And in that calmness, something inside me broke. I suddenly felt that I wasn't a person in this house. I was background noise. That my presence mattered only as long as it remained silent. From that evening on, I began to notice things I had previously ignored. How rarely anyone asked what I wanted. How often my wishes were automatically postponed. How easily I agreed without thinking. But the most frightening realization wasn't any of that. It was the understanding that if I disappeared, not physically but internally, no one would notice right away. I started staying out after work. Not for long. I would sit in a small cafe near the library, drink tea, and write in a notebook. These were letters I never intended to send. I wrote to Sergey about how he was a good man, but how I sometimes missed feeling truly seen. I wrote to Lisa about my fear that she had grown up too early. I wrote to Artem about how his noise wasn't a problem, but proof of life. And I wrote to myself, too. The younger Anna who believed that calmness and happiness were the same thing. Sergei sensed the change but didn't understand it. He noticed that I had grown distant, quieter, that I no longer reminded him of small things, no longer straightened his shirts, no longer held the household together the way I used to. He asked whether I was tired, and I said yes, because it was the simplest and safest explanation. Lisa understood more. She always had. One evening, she sat beside me and asked whether I was angry with them. In that moment, I realized how deeply children feel what adults try to hide. I hugged her and told her I loved them. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. A decision lived inside me, quiet, without hysteria or drama. I knew that if I took one step, our life would change. Not necessarily fall apart, just stop being what it had always been. And I wasn't afraid of the consequences. I was afraid of remaining the person I was becoming, convenient, invisible, silent to the point of disappearance. With time, I realized that it was impossible to understand our family without understanding Sergei. He wasn't cold. He was a man who had once decided that emotions must be controlled, and he made that decision long before I entered his life. Sergei grew up in a small, industrial town where houses stood close together, but people lived far apart. His father worked at a factory and came home exhausted, silent, carrying the heavy smell of metal and tobacco. He wasn't cruel. He didn't shout or hit, but he didn't speak either. Silence in their home wasn't an agreement. It was law. Any extra word felt like interference. Sergei's mother was calm, submissive, used to not asking questions. She cooked, cleaned, cared, but never argued. And from an early age, Sergei learned a simple rule: to keep peace. You must not feel too much. He became independent early, not because he was forced to, but because it was easier. He did his homework alone, got himself ready, solved his own problems. When other children complained to their parents, Sergei stayed quiet. When someone cried, he looked away. No one taught him this directly. He simply saw that emotions changed nothing, while silence preserved order. As a teenager, he was the good boy teachers praised and classmates overlooked. He didn't fight, didn't chase girls, didn't cause trouble. People found him boring, but reliable. And that word, reliable, became almost his only measure of self-worth. He never asked whether he was happy. He asked whether he was doing the right thing. When he left town to study, the place remained behind, but the habits did not. He studied well, worked alongside school, rented a small room, and never grew close to anyone. He had acquaintances, conversations, but no one he truly opened up to. He didn't know how, and he didn't see the point. When we met, Sergei was already over 30. Formed, adult, stable. There was no chaos in him. He didn't intoxicate or overwhelm. He simply existed beside me. He listened, nodded, remembered. I mistook his restraint for maturity, his silence for depth. And perhaps, in some way it was. Sergei loved me in his own way. He expressed love through actions, fixing things, driving, paying, checking, making sure. He didn't say, "I missed you," but he was always home on time. He didn't say, "I worry," but he called if I was late. His love was practical, functional, like a well-built mechanism. And for a long time, it was enough. When Lisa was born, he was confused. Not because he didn't love her, but because he didn't know what to do with such a volume of feeling. He held her carefully, as if afraid of breaking not just her body, but something inside himself. He wanted her life to be better than his, but didn't know how. With Artem, it was harder. Loud, unpredictable, emotional. He disrupted Sergei's internal order. Sometimes I saw confusion, even fear, in his eyes. He didn't get angry. He simply withdrew, hoping everything would settle down. As years passed, Sergei clung more tightly to stability. Work, schedules, responsibilities became his anchor. Everything there was clear: problems, solutions, results. At home, pauses grew longer, and he didn't know how to fill them. He didn't read hints, didn't ask unnecessary questions. And I increasingly chose silence over explanation. One evening, after the children were asleep, he sat across from me and remained silent for a long time. That alone was unusual, and in that pause, I realized he was afraid. Afraid not of losing the family, but of losing control over what had always felt stable. He said he didn't know what he was doing wrong, and for the first time in many years, there was uncertainty in his voice. I could have said everything was fine, that I was just tired, that it would pass, and perhaps we would have lived that way for many more years, quietly, correctly, almost perfectly. But I looked at him and understood. If I stayed silent now, I would betray not only myself, but our children too. Because children don't learn from words, they learn from how we live. I told him I was lonely, not because he was bad, but because there was too much unsaid between us, that I missed conversations without purpose, looks without reason, questions without solutions. I spoke slowly, carefully, afraid of breaking the moment. Sergei listened. He didn't interrupt, and that alone was already a step. He didn't understand immediately. He couldn't respond right away. But that night, he spoke about his father, for the first time in such detail. About fearing to disturb silence. About learning to be convenient. About believing stability was the highest form of love. He admitted he didn't know how to live differently, and that admission mattered more than any promise. Our conversation didn't fix everything. It wasn't the beginning of a fairy tale, but it became the point after which we stopped pretending nothing was happening. We began learning to speak, slowly, awkwardly, with pauses. Lisa came out of her room more often. Artem stopped holding himself back. The house didn't become loud, but it began to breathe. This story isn't about saving a marriage or destroying it. It's about how easily peace can be mistaken for emptiness, how good intentions can turn into walls, and how important it is, one day, to ask the question that long seemed unnecessary. Are we living the way we actually feel? Our family still looks perfect from the outside, but now there is movement inside it. And that means there is life.